Hey buddy, welcome back. If this is your first night here, pull the blanket up a little higher, turn the lights down low, and let your shoulders drop away from your ears. This is the place where old stories get told slowly, the way they used to be told, back before television, back before radio, back when the only light in the room came from a fire and the only sound was a voice. Tonight we are going all the way back to the sun-baked hills of ancient Greece, to a story that people were already telling as ancient history by the time the Parthenon was built. We are going to talk about a boy named Perseus, a locked bronze chamber, a monster with snakes for hair, and a very long walk across a world that had not yet been mapped. Before we start, if you like falling asleep to the quiet corners of history, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It does not cost you anything, and it means more of these will find their way to you on nights when your mind will not slow down. Now go ahead and get comfortable. You do not need to remember any of this. You do not even need to stay awake for all of it. Just let the story carry you. Wherever you are listening from tonight, I want you to picture it for a second. Maybe you are in Ohio, and it is just past 11 at night, rain tapping the window. Maybe you are in Texas, and the air conditioning is humming low, and it is closer to midnight. Maybe you are all the way over in the Philippines or the UK, and it is already tomorrow morning where you are, but you still could not sleep, so you came looking for a voice. Wherever you are, whatever time your clock says, we are about to sit together in the same imaginary firelight, 3,000 years away from tonight. A kingdom called Argos. Let's go inside the story slowly. The way you would walk into an old house you have never visited before, feeling your way along the wall until your eyes adjust to the dark. Long before Athens became the city we think of when we picture ancient Greece, there was a much older place called Argos, tucked into the northeastern corner of a peninsula called the Peloponnese. If you have ever looked at a map of Greece, and noticed how it looks almost like a hand reaching down into the Mediterranean Sea, the Peloponnese is the palm of that hand, and Argos sits near the wrist. Historians who study the Bronze Age, the period somewhere between 3,400 and 3,000 years ago, believe that Argos was one of the older settlements in that region, older even than the more famous citadel of Mycenaean that would later give its name to that whole era of Greek history. I want you to imagine the Argive plain the way it might have looked in that hazy, half-remembered time the Greeks themselves treated as legend even in their own golden age. Picture dry, pale soil, silver-green olive trees twisting up out of rocky ground, and in the distance, hills that turn a soft purple color in the late afternoon. The air there smells like dust and time, and cicadas buzz so loudly in the heat of the day that conversations sometimes just stop until the insects quiet down again. This was a world without paper, without coins as we know them, a world that ran on barley, wool, bronze, and the slow turning of the seasons. At the center of this world, according to the old stories, sat a king named Acrisius. He ruled Argos the way most Bronze Age kings ruled, from a fortified hilltop palace, surrounded by storerooms full of grain and oil, attended by scribes who kept track of that grain and oil on clay tablets using a script we now call linear. Archaeologists actually found tablets like this at sites such as Pylos and Mycenaean, and reading them today feels strangely intimate, because most of them are not grand declarations of war or love. They are inventories. So many jars of olive oil delivered to the palace, so many sheep counted at the spring shearing, so many measures of wheat set aside for the temple. It is a small, quiet reminder that even the most famous mythical kings were, underneath the legend, running something closer to a very large farm with a very complicated filing system. Acrisius, however, had a problem that no amount of careful bookkeeping could solve. He had no son. In that world, a son was not a matter of sentiment. A son was political survival. A son meant an heir who could hold the throne, defend the borders, and keep rival branches of the family from tearing the kingdom apart the moment the old king died. Acrisius had exactly one child, a daughter named Danae, and daughters, in the succession politics of the Bronze Age Aegean, were usually a bridge to some other man's power rather than a source of it themselves. So the king did what troubled rulers in these old stories almost always do. He traveled to consult an oracle. Now, before we go further, let's pause on that word oracle for a moment, because it is easy to hear it and picture something cartoonish, a woman in a cave muttering nonsense. The reality, at least by the time these stories were being written down centuries later, was much stranger and much more human. The most famous oracle in the Greek world sat at Delphi, high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where a priestess called the Pythia would sit on a tripod above a crack in the rock, breathe in whatever vapors rose from the earth, and speak in a trance. Her words were often confusing on purpose, riddling and layered, and it was the job of the priest standing nearby to shape her utterances into something a king could actually carry home and act on. People traveled for weeks, sometimes months, just to ask a single question and receive a single cryptic answer. Imagine making that journey. Weeks of walking or sailing, sleeping in modest guest houses along the way, arriving dusty and tired, only to be told something you could barely understand. Acrisius asked whether he would ever have a son of his own to inherit his throne, and the answer he received was not what he wanted at all. The oracle told him he would never have a son, but that his daughter Danae would bear a child, a grandson, and that this grandson was fated to kill him. Sit with that for a second. Not a rival king, not a foreign army, his own daughter's future child. A frightened king in an old story rarely responds with patience, and Acrisius did not either. He could not bring himself to kill his own daughter outright, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of fear of the gods' anger at spilling family blood, which the Greeks took very seriously. Instead, he built her a prison meant to outlast ordinary walls. According to the story as later Greek and Roman writers told it, he had a chamber constructed underground, or in some versions a tower with a bronze roof and bronze-lined walls, sealed away from every man in the kingdom. Danae would live there, guarded, untouched, unmarried, and therefore, Acrisius believed, unable to ever produce the grandson the oracle had promised. I want you to imagine what her days were actually like inside that chamber, because the myths themselves rush past this part, but it is worth slowing down on. A young woman, likely still a teenager by the standards of when noble daughters were considered marriageable in that era, living inside stone and bronze, with servants bringing her food, wool for weaving, oil lamps that had to be refilled and trimmed every single evening. In the Bronze Age Aegean, weaving was not a small hobby. It was one of the most important and time-consuming tasks a woman of any rank could do, and even a princess kept essentially under house arrest would likely have spent long hours at a loom, watching threads slowly become cloth, listening to the small rhythmic knock of the loom weights, because it was one of the very few activities that could fill an empty day. Picture the smell of that chamber too. Damp stone in the mornings before the sun warmed the walls, beeswax and olive oil from the lamps. The faint metallic tang that comes from being near a lot of worked bronze. Somewhere above her, she could probably hear the ordinary sounds of the palace continuing without her, footsteps on stone floors, the clatter of pottery, distant voices in the courtyard, sheep being driven somewhere for shearing. All of that life going on, and she was sealed away from it, waiting for nothing in particular, on the orders of a father trying to outrun a warning from the gods. Here is where the story stops being about politics and fear, and starts being about something much stranger. According to the myth, Zeus, the king of the gods, noticed Danae in her prison and desired her. Unable to reach her by any ordinary means since she was so thoroughly sealed away, Zeus is said to have come to her as a shower of gold, pouring down through a gap in the roof or a crack in the wall, depending on which ancient version you read. From this strange union, Danae became pregnant and in time gave birth to a son. She named him Perseus. Now, I know that detail, a god transforming into golden rain, sounds like exactly the kind of thing you would expect from Greek mythology, and it is worth remembering that the ancient Greeks themselves did not necessarily take every detail of these stories as literal historical fact, even in their own time. Educated Greeks in the classical period, people like the historian Herodotus writing in the 5th century before our era, already treated old myths with a kind of respectful skepticism, sometimes trying to explain them in more rational terms, sometimes simply repeating them because they were part of the shared cultural inheritance everyone recognized. The way we might repeat a story about George Washington and a cherry tree without necessarily believing it happened exactly that way. What the myth does capture, whether or not you take the golden shower literally, is something true about how ancient Greek storytellers thought about fate. Acrisius built the most secure prison he could imagine, using the best technology and architecture available to a Bronze Age king, and it did not matter. The prophecy found its way through anyway. That tension between human effort to control the future and the futility of trying to outrun fate runs through almost every Greek myth you will ever hear, and it is one of the reasons these stories still feel oddly modern, even now, sitting in your bed 3,000 years later. When Acrisius discovered that his daughter had given birth, whether he believed the story of the golden rain or suspected some more mundane explanation involving a lover who had somehow slipped past the guards, his fear did not go away. If anything, it sharpened. Now there was a very real infant in the world, a living grandson, exactly the person the oracle had warned him about. Let's pause here for a moment and just breathe. It is easy, listening to old myths, to rush from one dramatic beat to the next, but real storytellers, the ones who used to hold whole villages quiet around a fire, knew how to let a moment sit. So let it sit. A frightened old king, a daughter he loves but cannot bring himself to trust, an infant boy who has done nothing wrong at all, sleeping in his mother's arms, completely unaware that his own grandfather is, at this very moment, trying to decide whether he can bear to have them both killed. In the end, Acrisius could not order a direct execution, whether from lingering affection or from a very practical fear of divine punishment for killing his own blood, especially if the child truly was fathered by Zeus. He settled on something that let him feel less directly responsible while still, in effect, sentencing them both to death. He had Danae and the infant Perseus sealed inside a large wooden chest, and had that chest carried down to the sea and set adrift. Think about what that actually meant practically. This was not a symbolic gesture. A wooden chest on the open Aegean Sea, with no oars, no sail, no way to steer, entirely at the mercy of current and wind. Mother and child would have been in total or near total darkness, feeling every roll and dip of the waves, hearing water slap against the wood inches from their faces, with no way of knowing whether the next moment would bring land, a fisherman's net, or the slow horror of a chest quietly filling with seawater. It is one of the most quietly terrifying images in all of Greek myth, precisely because there is no monster in it at all. Just wood, water, and time. According to the story, the sea did not swallow them. The chest drifted for what we are told was a considerable stretch of time before it eventually washed ashore, or was pulled from the water, on a small island called Seriphos, one of the many rocky islands scattered through the Aegean Sea in the group we now call the Cyclades. It was there on that island that a fisherman found them, and it is there that the next chapter of Perseus's story really begins. We will get to that fisherman, and to the island of Seriphos, and to the strange and rather petty king who ruled it. But for now, let the image of that drifting chest settle in your mind like a stone sinking slowly through dark water. A mother, holding her son close in the dark, listening to the sea, having no idea at all what kind of life was waiting for either of them on the other side of that voyage. The island of Seriphos, imagine this for a moment. Early morning, the sky just turning from gray to that pale, washed-out gold that happens right before real sunrise. A man walks along a rocky shoreline, carrying a net over one shoulder, his feet already used to the uneven stones underfoot. This is a small island called Seriphos, one of dozens of islands in the Cyclades, a place with thin soil, plenty of wind, and a population that made its living mostly from fishing, small-scale farming, and, we know from later history, from mining certain minerals out of the local rock. It was never one of the great powers of the ancient Greek world. It was the kind of place that history books mention only in passing, if at all, and that is exactly what makes it worth pausing on, because most people in the ancient world, just like most people today, lived their entire lives in places exactly like this. Small, quiet, unremarkable to outsiders, and completely whole to the people who called it home. The fisherman's name, according to the ancient sources, was Dictys. As he worked his net that morning, or in some versions of the story simply walked the shore checking for anything the tide had brought in, he noticed something unusual floating just offshore. A large wooden chest, waterlogged, riding low but somehow still afloat. We can only imagine what went through his mind as he weighed it out and pulled it toward the beach, the weight of it dragging against the surf, the wood swollen and heavy with seawater. Perhaps he expected cargo. Perhaps he expected nothing at all, just driftwood worth salvaging for its timber. What he found instead when he pried the lid open was a woman, exhausted and half-starved, and a small child, somehow still alive after however many days at sea. Dictys took them in. This detail matters more than it might seem at first, because in the ancient world, hospitality toward strangers, what the Greeks called xenia, was not just a nice gesture. It was considered a sacred obligation, protected by Zeus himself in his role as a guardian of guests and travelers. A stranger who washed up on your shore, storm-tossed and desperate, was to be fed, sheltered, and helped, not questioned or turned away. And many of the oldest Greek stories, including large parts of the Odyssey, revolve entirely around what happens when that unwritten rule is honored or broken. Dictys honored it without hesitation, and in doing so, quietly saved the lives of both Danae and her infant son. Let's slow down here and imagine what life actually looked like for Danae and the young Perseus growing up on this modest island, far from the bronze-walled prison and the anxious politics of Argos. Picture a small stone house near the shore, its walls thick to keep out both the summer heat and the winter wind. A single main room where cooking, eating, and much of daily life happened around a central hearth. Firelight would have been the main light source after dark, along with small oil lamps, their wicks trimmed carefully because oil was valuable and not to be wasted. The smell of wood smoke would have clung to clothing and hair almost constantly, mixed with the salt smell that never quite leaves a fishing village, and the sharper scent of drying fish hung on racks near the shore to preserve them for the leaner months. Perseus, growing up in a fisherman's household rather than a palace, would have lived a life shaped by very different rhythms than the one his grandfather Acrisius knew back in Argos. Instead of scribes and grain stores, his early years would have been marked by the sound of waves against the hull of small fishing boats, the rough texture of nets that needed constant mending, the particular ache in your shoulders after hauling in a catch. Children in households like this were expected to help from a fairly young age, coiling rope, carrying water, learning to identify which fish were worth keeping, and which needed to go straight back into the sea. There would have been little in his daily life to suggest he was, by blood, the grandson of a king, and by story at least, the son of the greatest of the gods. I think there is something worth pausing on in that contrast. So many of the heroes in Greek mythology, Perseus among them, do not grow up surrounded by wealth and comfort. They grow up displaced, often in modest circumstances, raised by people who are not their biological family, shaped by hardship long before they ever pick up a sword or face a monster. It is tempting to read this as pure narrative convenience, a way of setting up a dramatic reversal later, and it certainly serves that purpose. But it also reflects something the ancient Greeks seemed to believe quite sincerely, which is that character was tested and built through hardship, not granted automatically by noble birth. A hero raised soft in a palace would not, in their imagination, have been half as compelling as one raised on a wind-scoured island, mending nets before dawn. Years passed this way, the story tells us, quietly and without much incident. Perseus grew from an infant into a boy, and eventually into a young man, strong from the physical work of island life, familiar with the sea in a way that would later matter more than anyone on Seriphos could have guessed. Danae, for her part, remained under the protection of Dictys, and according to most versions of the story, the two of them lived together for years in a relationship that seems to have been respectful and protective rather than romantic, at least in this telling, though later Roman poets sometimes shaded the relationship differently. It was not Dictys who would eventually set the next part of this story in motion. It was his brother. A king's unwelcome attention, Seriphos, small as it was, still had a ruler, and that ruler was a man named Polydectes, the brother of the fisherman Dictys. Where Dictys had shown Danae and her son nothing but decency, Polydectes was, by every account that survives, a very different kind of man. As the years passed and Danae grew into adulthood on his island, still remarkably beautiful according to the storytellers, Polydectes began to want her for himself. I want to be careful and clear here, in the same calm way we have been moving through this whole story, because this part of the myth is really about coercion dressed up as courtship. Danae was not interested in marrying Polydectes, and by this point Perseus, now grown into a strong young man, stood as a fairly obvious obstacle to whatever plans the king had in mind. A grown son, protective of his mother, was not someone Polydectes could simply push aside or ignore, and so the king began looking for a way to remove Perseus from the picture entirely, preferably in a manner that would not look like an outright murder, since killing a young man outright, especially one under the general protection of his own brother Dictys, would have caused exactly the kind of scandal a small island king could not afford. So Polydectes did what a great many manipulative rulers in old stories do. He staged an elaborate pretext. According to the myth, Polydectes announced that he intended to marry a different woman entirely, a princess named Hippodamia, and declared that he would be collecting wedding gifts from all the notable men of the island to present to her, as was customary for a king making a grand match. Every guest at the feast he threw was expected to bring a suitable contribution, generally a fine horse, since horses were among the most prestigious gifts a wealthy man could offer in that era. Perseus, however, had grown up poor, the adopted son of a fisherman, with no horses to his name and no way to buy one. Imagine sitting at that feast, buddy. Long tables set outdoors under a clear Aegean sky, torches burning at the corners of the courtyard, the smell of roasted meat and spilled wine thick in the warm evening air. Around you, wealthier men present their gifts one by one, each horse led forward to murmurs of approval, each gift another small performance of status in a society that ran heavily on public displays of honor and shame. And there sits Perseus, a young man with nothing to offer, watching the king's eyes settle on him with something that might have looked like sympathy, but was really something closer to satisfaction. Polydectes, playing the wounded host, asked Perseus directly why he had brought no gift, knowing full well the young man had nothing to give. And Perseus, stung by the public embarrassment, and perhaps still young enough to feel that his honor was worth more than his own safety, made an offer any careful old man in that hall should have warned him against. He declared that he would bring the king anything he asked for, even, he said, the head of the Gorgon Medusa, if that was what the king wanted. Polydectes, of course, had been waiting for exactly this kind of overreach. He accepted the offer immediately, in front of every witness at the feast, making it impossible for Perseus to quietly withdraw the boast later without shaming himself, and by extension, his mother and his adoptive family. In one careless sentence, spoken in wounded pride at a wedding feast that likely was never even sincere, Perseus had committed himself to hunting down one of the most feared creatures in the entire Greek imagination. Who was Medusa, really? Before we follow Perseus any further, let's slow down and spend some real time with Medusa herself, because most retellings rush past her as though she were nothing more than an obstacle, a monster to be defeated, and that does not do justice to one of the more strange, and honestly, one of the more sad figures in the whole of Greek mythology. The word Gorgon referred to a trio of sisters, monstrous female beings usually described as having hair made of living, hissing snakes, bronze claws, sometimes wings, and a face so terrible that any mortal who looked directly upon it would turn instantly to stone. Two of the sisters, Estheno and Uriel, were said to be immortal, unkillable by any means available to gods or men. The third sister, Medusa, was mortal, and it was this single detail, buried in an otherwise fantastical family of monsters, that made her the only Gorgon a hero could realistically hope to defeat. Now here is where the story gets more complicated and more interesting, depending on which ancient source you read. In the oldest surviving accounts, including the work of the poet Hesiod writing sometime around the 7th century before our era, Medusa and her sisters seem to have simply been born monstrous, daughters of ancient sea deities named Phorcys and Seta, part of an older, stranger generation of divine beings that existed before the more familiar Olympian gods like Zeus and Athena rose to prominence. In that version, there is no tragedy attached to her at all. She is simply what she is, a monster among monsters living at the edge of the known world. But centuries later, the Roman poet Ovid told a very different version of her story, one that has become, over time, almost as famous as the original. In Ovid's telling, Medusa was not born a monster at all. She was once a beautiful young woman, a priestess in the service of the goddess Athena, admired for the very thing that would later become her curse, her beautiful hair. According to Ovid, the sea god Poseidon violated her inside Athena's own temple, and rather than punishing Poseidon, Athena, in her anger, punished Medusa instead, transforming her famous hair into a mass of writhing snakes, and cursing her face so that anyone who looked upon her would turn to stone. I want to sit with that version for a moment, because it changes the entire emotional weight of the story we are telling tonight. If you take Ovid's account seriously, then the creature Perseus is about to hunt down was not born a villain at all. She was a victim, twice over, first of an assault she never asked for, and then of a punishment delivered by the very goddess she had served faithfully, a punishment that turned her into something to be feared and eventually destroyed rather than someone to be protected. It is worth remembering that ancient myths were rarely fixed and final the way a modern printed book is. They shifted from storyteller to storyteller, from region to region, from century to century, and different versions could carry very different moral undertones depending on who was telling them and why. Because of this layered history, it becomes almost impossible to say with certainty which version an ordinary person in, say, 5th century Athens would have believed, or whether they thought about it that deeply at all. Myths were living things, retold at festivals, painted onto pottery, carved into temple friezes, sung by traveling poets, and each teller shaped the emotional weight to fit their own purpose. What we can say for certain is that regardless of how she came to be that way, by the time Perseus enters her story, Medusa was living somewhere at the far edges of the known world, alongside her two immortal sisters, and her gaze alone was lethal to any living creature unfortunate enough to meet it. I want you to imagine, for just a moment, what it must have been like to be Medusa in the years before Perseus ever set out to find her. Picture a rocky, wind-battered coastline at what the Greeks imagined as the very edge of the world, somewhere out past the lands they actually knew anything about, in the vague geographic direction of Libya in North Africa according to some ancient sources. No neighbors. No visitors except the occasional unlucky sailor or hunter who stumbled too close and never left again, their bodies turned instantly to cold gray stone, frozen mid-stride, mid-breath, scattered like broken statues across the ground near her cave. There is something profoundly lonely in that image, whichever version of her backstory you choose to believe. A being who could never again look directly at another living thing without destroying it. No conversation held face to face. No gentle contact. Even her two sisters, monstrous as they were themselves, must have had to be careful around her, perhaps positioning themselves at angles, perhaps simply growing used to speaking to her without ever quite meeting her eyes. It is easy, listening to this story as pure adventure, to forget that the so-called monster at the center of it may well have been the loneliest figure in the entire tale, waiting at the edge of the map for a hero she never asked to be hunted by. We will return to her, and to that final encounter, later in the story. But first, we need to follow Perseus through what might be the strangest and most overlooked part of his entire journey. The part where a frightened young man with no weapons and no plan has to somehow become someone capable of doing what he had so rashly promised. Gathering what he would need, let's go inside this next part of the story slowly, because it is easy to skip over, and it is actually one of the more thoughtful sections of the whole myth. Perseus, according to the ancient sources, left Seriphos with essentially nothing. No weapon suited to killing a Gorgon, no map showing where the Gorgons even lived, since their home was said to lie somewhere beyond the edges of any territory ordinary sailors ever charted. A less careful storyteller might simply have had him wander off into the wilderness and stumble onto success through sheer luck. But the version of this story that survived into our own time is more interesting than that, because it insists that even a hero favored by the gods cannot simply walk into danger unprepared. Perseus needed help, and specifically, he needed the help of two gods who took a particular interest in his fate, Athena and Hermes. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, and Hermes, the messenger god known for his cleverness and his ability to move between worlds, are said to have appeared to Perseus not long after he left the island, guiding him toward what he would actually need to survive an encounter with Medusa. This detail matters more than it might first appear, because it reframes the entire quest. Perseus does not succeed through brute strength or sheer bravery alone. He succeeds because he is willing to listen, to accept guidance, and to use tools and strategy rather than charging in blindly. In a culture that prized cleverness, what the Greeks called medes, nearly as highly as physical courage. This was an important quality in a hero. The first thing Perseus needed to find, according to the story, were three strange sisters known as the Gree, sometimes translated as the Grey Ones. The Gree were said to be ancient beings, sisters to the Gorgons themselves, and unlike almost any other figures in Greek mythology, they were described as having been born already old, gray-haired from birth, and sharing among the three of them only a single eye and a single tooth, which they passed back and forth to one another as needed. Imagine that image for a moment. Three sisters standing together in some dim, forgotten corner of the world, and only one of them able to see at any given moment, carefully handing a single eyeball between them like a precious object none of them can afford to drop. The Gree knew the location of the nymphs who possessed the tools Perseus would need for his quest, but they were not inclined to share that information freely. So Perseus, guided by Athena's counsel, used a bit of clever, almost mischievous strategy. As the sisters passed the single eye between themselves, he waited for the exact moment when neither sister currently held it, snatched it out of the air, and refused to return it until they told him what he needed to know. It is a strange, almost comic scene when you picture it slowly. Three ancient gray sisters groping blindly in the dark, arguing among themselves, while a young man stands nearby holding their one shared eye hostage. And yet it is also a scene that tells us something important about how these old stories imagined cleverness winning out over raw power. Perseus did not fight the Gree. He simply outmaneuvered them. Once the Gree had reluctantly given up the location of the nymphs, Perseus made his way there, and it is with these nymphs that he acquired the three items that would actually make his quest survivable. The first was a pair of winged sandals, capable of carrying him swiftly through the air, sparing him what would otherwise have been an impossibly long journey on foot to the far edge of the known world. The second was a special pouch, sometimes called a kibises in the old Greek accounts, sturdy enough and strange enough to safely hold something as dangerous as a severed Gorgon's head, without whoever carried it being harmed by its power. And the third, perhaps the strangest gift of all, was the cap of Hades, sometimes called the cap of invisibility, a helmet belonging to the god of the underworld himself, which would allow whoever wore it to move about completely unseen. In addition to these three gifts from the nymphs, the god Hermes lent Perseus a curved sword, sometimes described as a sickle called a harp, sharp enough and strong enough to cut through the unusually tough neck of a Gorgon in a single stroke, since an ordinary bronze sword might not have managed the job cleanly, if at all. And Athena, for her part, gave him something that would prove to be the single most important gift of the entire quest, a polished bronze shield, so reflective it functioned almost like a mirror. I want you to sit with that shield for a moment, because it is the detail that makes the entire climax of this story work, and it reflects something the ancient Greeks understood deeply about how to survive a threat you cannot look at directly. If Medusa's gaze alone could turn a man to stone, then no amount of courage or strength would help Perseus if he approached her the way a hero approaches an ordinary enemy, face to face, eyes locked on the target. He needed a way to fight her without ever looking directly at her, and Athena's shield gave him exactly that. By watching Medusa's reflection in the polished bronze surface, rather than looking at her directly with his own eyes. Perseus would be able to track her movements, judge his strike, and defend himself, all without ever risking the one thing that had turned countless careless hunters before him into cold, silent statues. Picture Perseus now, standing somewhere quiet, perhaps on a rocky outcrop overlooking the sea, examining each of these strange gifts in the fading evening light. Winged sandals resting near his feet, their leather straps unfamiliar in his hands. A helmet that could make him vanish from sight entirely. A curved blade lent by a god. A polished shield that threw back his own tired, uncertain face whenever he looked into it. He was no longer simply a fisherman's adopted son who had made a rash promise at a wedding feast. He was, whether he felt ready or not, becoming something else entirely. A young man equipped, guided, and quietly expected by the gods themselves to succeed at something almost no one else would have dared attempt. The edge of the world imagined this for a moment. Perseus rising into the air on his borrowed winged sandals, the coastline of the known Greek world shrinking below him, the sea turning into a vast blue-gray sheet stretching in every direction. There is something almost meditative about this part of the journey, even in the ancient tellings. No monster to fight yet, no danger pressing in immediately, just the long, quiet passage across unfamiliar territory, the wind pulling at his hair and clothing, the strange sensation of a young man who grew up walking sandy island paths, now moving through open sky. The ancient sources place the home of the Gorgons in a vague, distant region, sometimes associated with Libya, sometimes described simply as lying beyond the edges of the world that ordinary Greek sailors knew. This vagueness is worth noting, because it tells us something about how the Greeks imagined their own geography. The eastern Mediterranean, the coasts of Greece, Anatolia, and the Aegean Islands, these were known, mapped in the practical sense that sailors passed down routes and landmarks from one generation to the next. But beyond that, the edges of the map dissolved into myth. Monsters, according to Greek imagination, tended to live exactly where knowledge ran out, at the far borders of what any traveler had actually seen with his own eyes. It is a very old and very human habit, filling the blank spaces on a map with our worst fears. As Perseus approached the region where the Gorgons made their home, the landscape itself would have begun to change in ways that likely unsettled even the winged sandals carrying him. The ancient accounts describe a landscape scattered with statues, though of course they were not statues at all. They were the petrified remains of men and animals who had wandered too close to Medusa over the years, caught for one fatal instant in whatever ordinary moment they happened to be living through. A hunter frozen mid-step, a bird caught mid-flight, somehow turned to solid stone even in the air before falling and shattering on the ground below. It must have looked less like an art gallery and more like the aftermath of some silent catastrophe, a place where time itself seemed to have simply stopped for a scattered handful of unlucky travelers. Let's slow down even further, because this is the moment the entire story has been building toward, and it deserves to be told gently rather than rushed. According to the myth, Perseus found the three Gorgon sisters asleep when he arrived, which was, in its own way, an act of mercy on the part of the storytellers, since it meant he did not have to face Medusa's open, waking gaze at all. Wearing the cap of Hades, he moved unseen among the strange, snake-haired sisters, careful and silent, his winged sandals allowing him to hover just above the ground rather than risk the sound of footsteps on loose stone. He held Athena's polished shield angled in front of him, using its mirrored surface to locate Medusa among her sisters without ever once looking directly at her with his own eyes, watching instead a small, safe, reflected version of the scene playing out before him. I want you to really picture this moment slowly, the way an old storyteller by a fire would draw it out rather than rush past it. The soft, uneven breathing of three sleeping monstrous women. The faint, dry rustle of snakes shifting in Medusa's hair even in her sleep, hissing so quietly it might have been mistaken for wind moving through dry grass. The cool weight of the bronze shield in Perseus's hands, angled just so, catching the pale light of that distant place and throwing back a small, contained, survivable reflection of the very thing that could destroy him if he looked at it directly. Guided by Athena, who is described in several ancient sources as steadying his hand at the crucial moment, Perseus struck downward with the curved sword Hermes had lent him, keeping his eyes fixed entirely on the reflection in his shield rather than on Medusa herself, and in one motion, severed her head from her body. The ancient poets describe what happened next in a way that still manages to feel strange and almost tender rather than purely violent. From the wound, two beings sprang forth fully formed, said to have been fathered by Poseidon during that earlier encounter in Athena's temple, whichever version of that story you choose to believe. One was a magnificent winged horse named Pegasus, destined to become one of the most enduring images in all of Greek mythology, later associated with poetic inspiration, and eventually placed among the stars as a constellation. The other was a giant named Chrysaor, whose name meant something like the one with the golden sword, though his story receives far less attention in the surviving myths than his more famous winged sibling. There is something worth sitting with in that image, strange as it is. Even in the moment of her death, something new and unexpectedly beautiful came out of Medusa, a winged horse bursting forth into the pale morning light of that distant, forgotten place, as if the story itself could not quite let her end in pure horror alone. Perseus, working quickly now, placed Medusa's severed head into the magical pouch the nymphs had given him, careful never to let it slip or turn outward, since even in death, the head retained its power to turn any living thing that looked upon it directly to stone. Then, according to the story, Medusa's two sisters, Estheno and Uriel, woke and discovered what had happened and gave chase, shrieking in fury and grief for their fallen sister. But Perseus, invisible beneath the cap of Hades and swift on his winged sandals, escaped into the sky before either of them could reach him, leaving the edge of the world behind and beginning the long journey home. The long way home if the story ended right there, with Perseus simply flying home victorious. It would already be a satisfying tale. But the old storytellers were not finished with him yet, and the journey back from the edge of the world turned out to be almost as eventful as the quest itself. Let's go inside this next scene slowly. Somewhere along his long flight home, according to several ancient sources, Perseus passed over the region of North Africa where, in the Greek imagination, a titan named Atlas stood bearing the weight of the sky upon his shoulders, an eternal punishment handed down after the war between the gods and the Titans. In one version of the story, Atlas, weary and inhospitable, refused Perseus any rest or shelter, perhaps out of an old prophecy warning him that a son of Zeus would one day steal the golden apples his daughters guarded. Perseus, in this telling, is said to have shown Atlas the head of Medusa, whether out of frustration or simple self-defense, and the Titan turned instantly to stone, his massive form becoming the literal mountain range in northwestern Africa that still bears his name today. Whether or not you take that particular episode as anything more than the ancient Greeks trying to explain the origin of an actual mountain range they knew existed, but did not fully understand, it tells us something interesting about how these myths often worked. They were not only entertainment. They were also, in their own strange way, an early attempt at explaining the natural world, weaving real geography into stories about gods and heroes, so that a mountain range, a rock formation, or a strange coastline could carry meaning and memory rather than sitting silent and unexplained on the horizon. The most emotionally significant stop on Perseus's journey home, though, came next, along the coast of a kingdom the ancient sources call Ethiopia, though it is worth noting that ancient Greek geography used that term rather loosely to describe distant lands to the south and east, not necessarily matching our modern borders. There, according to the myth, ruled a king named Seriphos and a queen named Cassiopeia, and it was Cassiopeia's own pride that set the next disaster in motion. Cassiopeia, the story tells us, had boasted that she, or in some versions her daughter, was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs who served under the god Poseidon. This kind of boast, comparing a mortal favorably against divine beings, was almost always a fatal mistake in Greek mythology, a sin the Greeks called hubris, and the gods rarely let it pass without punishment. Poseidon, angered on behalf of the Nereids, sent a sea monster, sometimes called Cetus in the ancient accounts, to ravage the kingdom's coastline, and when the desperate king consulted an oracle for a solution, he was told that the only way to stop the destruction was to sacrifice his own daughter, a young woman named Andromeda, by chaining her to a rock along the shore and leaving her for the monster to claim. I want you to imagine that scene now, quietly and without rushing. A rocky shoreline at dawn, waves breaking cold and gray against the base of a tall sea cliff. A young woman chained at the wrists to the rock, her feet bare against the wet stone, salt spray reaching her even from a distance, the wind pulling at her hair and clothing. Somewhere behind her on the higher ground, her parents watch, unable to do anything at all, bound by the words of an oracle and the desperate hope that this single sacrifice might spare the rest of their kingdom. There is no drama of battle here yet, only the terrible, drawn-out waiting, the kind of fear that comes not from a sudden shock but from watching the horizon and knowing something terrible is going to arrive. You simply do not know exactly when. It was in this moment, flying home along the coastline with Medusa's head safely sealed in his pouch, that Perseus happened to look down and see her. According to the ancient accounts, he was struck immediately by her, moved by both her beauty and the injustice of her situation, and he made his way down to speak with her parents, offering to kill the sea monster and free her, on the condition that if he succeeded, she would be given to him in marriage. King Seriphos, faced with the prospect of losing his daughter entirely versus the chance, however unlikely, of saving her through the help of this unexpected stranger, agreed. What followed was, by the standards of these old stories, a fairly straightforward fight, though no less dramatic for its simplicity. As the sea monster rose from the water, moving toward the chained and helpless Andromeda, Perseus swooped down from above, using either the curved sword still in his possession or, in some versions of the story, Medusa's severed head itself, striking at the creature from angles it could not easily defend against, since he had the advantage of flight that the monster, bound to the sea, did not share. After a fierce struggle, Perseus killed the creature, freed Andromeda from her chains, and in doing so earned both her hand in marriage and a place in this story that has outlasted nearly every other detail of his adventure, since the pairing of Perseus and Andromeda would go on to be remembered, painted, and eventually mapped onto the night sky itself, with both of their names, along with Cassiopeia, Cepheus, and even the sea monster Cetus, given as constellations still visible to anyone who looks up on a clear autumn night. There is something worth pausing on here before we move forward. This entire episode with Andromeda has, at times, felt oddly disconnected from Perseus's earlier quest to kill Medusa, almost as though two separate old stories were stitched together at some point by ancient storytellers who liked the way they complemented each other. And in a sense, that may be exactly what happened. Greek myths were rarely composed all at once by a single author with a tidy master plan. They accumulated over centuries, shaped by countless poets, playwrights, and vase painters, each one adding, adjusting, or emphasizing different details to suit their own audience and their own moment in history. What we inherit today as a single flowing narrative is really more like a very old patchwork quilt, sewn together from many different hands across many different generations, and it is worth appreciating the seams even as we admire the whole finished pattern. A homecoming long overdue with Andromeda now traveling beside him, Perseus finally turned his winged sandals back toward Seriphos, the small, wind-scoured island where his entire strange story had begun. It had likely been many months, perhaps longer, since he had left that wedding feast in wounded pride, making a promise almost no one in that torch-lit courtyard believed he could actually fulfill. Let's imagine, for a moment, what it must have felt like to finally see that familiar rocky coastline rising up out of the sea again, the same shore where a fisherman had once pulled a waterlogged chest containing his mother and himself out of the surf so many years before. But home had not stayed frozen in place while Perseus was away. According to the story, King Polydex, confident that he had sent the young man to a death he would never return from, had continued pressing his unwanted attention onto Danae in his absence, and by the time Perseus returned, matters had grown considerably worse. Danae, along with the fisherman Dictys who had raised Perseus and always protected her, had reportedly been forced to take refuge at a sacred altar, a temple sanctuary, seeking the kind of protection that ancient religious custom offered even against a king, since dragging someone forcibly away from sanctuary at an altar was considered a serious offense against the gods themselves. Perseus arrived to find his mother in this state, sheltering in fear from a man who had sent him away specifically to be rid of him. It is worth sitting with the anger that must have been present in that moment, not the theatrical fury of an action story, but something colder and more grounded, the particular fury of a son who left as an untested boy and returned having faced down one of the most feared creatures in the world, only to find that his absence had made his mother's situation worse rather than better. According to the myth, Perseus made his way to the palace, where Polydex was holding court, most likely still fully expecting that this whole affair had ended in his favor months earlier. What followed did not require a lengthy battle or a drawn-out confrontation. Perseus is said to have simply revealed the head of Medusa, still carrying its terrible power even after all this time and distance, and Polydex, along with, in some versions of the story, several of his supporters gathered in the hall around him, were instantly turned to stone. I want you to imagine the strange, sudden silence of that room in the moment right after. No cries, no final words, just the abrupt stillness of men and furniture and torchlight falling across figures that would never move again. A throne room turned, in one single instant, into something closer to a tomb, populated by cold gray statues frozen in whatever posture they happened to hold the moment Perseus lifted the head from its pouch. With Polydex gone, Perseus placed the kind fisherman Dictys, the man who had shown his mother nothing but decency since the day she washed ashore, on the throne of Seriphos in his place, a small but meaningful act of gratitude toward the one person on that island who had never asked for anything in return for his kindness. As for the head of Medusa itself, Perseus is said to have eventually given it to the goddess Athena, who placed it at the center of her own shield or breastplate, the aegis, where it continued to serve as a defensive weapon and a warning to any enemy who might otherwise have dared to challenge her. With his mother safe, his adoptive family honored, and his impossible promise finally fulfilled, Perseus might easily have settled into a quiet life on Seriphos, or returned in triumph to reclaim his birthright in Argos. But the old oracle that had set this entire chain of events in motion so many years earlier, warning King Acrisius that his own grandson would one day be the cause of his death, had not yet run its course, and it is here that the story circles back to where it began. According to most versions of the myth, Perseus, now grown into a celebrated hero with a wife and a formidable reputation, eventually traveled toward Argos, whether to reclaim his birthright, to compete in athletic games, or simply to reconcile with the grandfather who had once tried to have him killed as an infant, depending on which ancient source you consult. Acrisius, hearing that his grandson was approaching, and perhaps still haunted by that old prophecy after all these years, is said to have fled the city rather than face him, traveling to a distant town to stay out of Perseus's path entirely. It did no good. The story tells us that Perseus, participating in athletic games in that very town, whether at a funeral celebration or a regular festival depending on the version, threw a discus during the competition, and the wind carried it off course, striking an elderly spectator among the crowd and killing him instantly. That spectator was Acrisius. There is something quietly devastating in the shape of that ending, and it is worth letting it sit for a moment rather than rushing past it toward a tidy conclusion. Acrisius spent an entire lifetime trying to outmaneuver a single sentence from an oracle, sealing his daughter away in bronze, setting an infant adrift on the open sea, and in the end, fleeing his own home rather than face a grown man who likely bore him no active malice at all by that point. And still, an accident, a gust of wind, a discus thrown in an ordinary athletic contest, brought the prophecy to pass exactly as it had been foretold decades earlier. Perseus did not seek to kill his grandfather. He simply could not escape the shape fate had already carved for both of them, long before either of them had any say in the matter. What came after grief-stricken by what he had done, even though it had been a genuine accident? Perseus reportedly could not bring himself to return to Argos and claim the throne his grandfather had once held, feeling that it would be wrong to rule a city under the shadow of that death, even one he had never intended. Instead, according to the story, he arranged an exchange of kingdoms with a relative named Megapens, trading his claim on Argos for rule over a nearby territory called Turins. It is at this point that the myth quietly slides into something closer to genuine ancient history, or at least into the kind of legendary history that ancient Greeks themselves believed connected their mythic past to real, physical places they could still visit. Perseus is credited in several ancient accounts with founding the city of Mycenaean, the very settlement that would eventually give its name to the entire Bronze Age civilization we study today. The Mycenaean world of the Trojan War, of Agamemnon, of massive stone fortifications and golden burial masks. Archaeologists who have excavated Mycenaean, most famously beginning with Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century, uncovered a genuinely ancient and genuinely wealthy settlement dating back to roughly the same broad era these myths are set in, complete with the famous Lion Gate entrance and shaft graves filled with gold masks, weapons, and jewelry. Now, to be clear, there is no archaeological evidence that a specific man named Perseus, son of Danae, actually laid the first stones of Mycenae with his own hands. What the myth captures instead is something the ancient Greeks themselves seem to feel quite strongly, a sense that their oldest and most impressive ruins must have been built by figures larger than ordinary human effort could explain, heroes descended from gods, capable of feats no farmer or craftsman of their own time could match. When later Greeks looked at the massive stone blocks of the Lion Gate, so large and so precisely fitted that they seemed almost impossible for human hands alone to have lifted into place, it made a certain intuitive sense to them that such walls must have been raised by heroes, or by mythical giants called cyclopes working under the direction of heroes like Perseus, rather than by the more ordinary explanation of skilled Bronze Age engineering and generations of accumulated labor. Perseus and Andromeda, according to the genealogies later Greek writers pieced together, went on to have several children together, and their descendants formed what is often called the Perseid dynasty, a lineage of legendary kings and heroes that Greek mythographers connected all the way down to Heracles himself, arguably the single most famous hero in the entire body of Greek myth. This kind of genealogical connecting was extremely common in the ancient world. Cities and noble families took real pride in tracing their lineage back to a mythical hero or a god, since it lent both legitimacy and glory to their present-day status. And it is worth remembering that When we hear these old stories today, we are often hearing the polished, carefully arranged version that some particular family or city wanted remembered, rather than a single, neutral historical record. An ordinary evening, 3,000 years ago. Before we bring this story to a close, I want to take you somewhere quiet for a moment, away from oracles and monsters and prophecies, because it is easy, after a story this full of drama, to forget that all of it was imagined and told by very ordinary people living very ordinary lives. Picture a household somewhere in the Greek world, perhaps a few generations after these events were supposed to have happened, sometime in the early Iron Age, a period we know surprisingly little about compared to the flashier Bronze Age that came before it and the classical era that came after. A small stone house, a hearth fire burning low in the center of the main room, its light throwing long shadows against walls made of mud brick and rough stone. Outside, sheep are penned for the night, and somewhere nearby the sea is audible even through closed doors, a constant, low background presence that never really goes away for people who live near the water. Inside, a family gathers after the work of the day is finished, the way families everywhere have always gathered once the sun goes down and there is nothing left to do but rest. Perhaps an older relative, someone who has heard these stories 100 times from their own parents and grandparents, begins telling the tale of Perseus to the younger children, the details shifting slightly with each telling, the way oral storytelling always does before writing ever fixes a story permanently into a single form. Maybe the fire pops and sends up a small shower of sparks right at the moment Medusa's sisters wake and give chase, and one of the youngest children flinches, only to be reassured with a quiet laugh that he escaped. He always escapes. That is how the story goes. I think there is something worth appreciating in that image, something easy to lose when we read these myths today as polished stories with clear beginnings and endings, official versions preserved in old books. For most of their long history, these stories about Perseus were not fixed texts at all. They were living, breathing things, passed by voice from one generation to the next, softened or sharpened depending on who was telling them and who was listening, shaped by firelight and tired children, and the particular cadence of whichever grandmother or old sailor happened to be doing the telling that night. It was only much later, when poets like Hesiod and eventually Roman writers like Ovid began writing these stories down, that they took on the more fixed shapes we recognize today, shapes that even then continued to shift slightly from one author to the next. There is a kind of comfort in that, I think, especially at this hour of the night. The version of this story I have been telling you tonight is not the only version, and it was never meant to be. It is one thread in a very long, very old braid of storytelling, stretching back to actual people, sitting by actual fires, doing exactly what we are doing together right now. Telling an old story slowly so that someone tired can finally rest. A face that outlived the story before we let this story rest completely. I want to take you on one more quiet walk, this time not through myth, but through the strange afterlife that Medusa's face went on to have across thousands of years of art and architecture, long after anyone still believed a real Gorgon lived at the edge of the world. If you have ever visited a museum with an ancient Greek collection, or even just seen photographs of Greek temples and pottery, there is a good chance you have already seen Medusa's face without necessarily realizing what you were looking at. In the earlier archaic period of Greek art, roughly between the 8th and 6th centuries before our era, artists rendered her not as a tragic, beautiful woman, but as something closer to a grotesque mask, wide-eyed, tongue often sticking out, tusks sometimes protruding from her mouth, hair a wild tangle. This particular image, called the Gorgon, was placed on shields, on temple pediments, on the aprons of armor, and above doorways, not to frighten visitors away exactly, but to serve as a kind of protective ward, a symbol meant to turn danger and misfortune back upon itself, the same way her gaze had once turned living men to stone. It is worth pausing on that idea for a moment, because it tells us something about how differently ancient people thought about frightening images compared to how we often think about them today. We tend to associate monstrous faces purely with horror, something meant only to unsettle. But for the Greeks, and later for the Romans who adopted many of the same visual traditions, a truly terrifying face could also be a kind of shield, something you placed at your most vulnerable points. A doorway, the center of a shield, the prow of a ship, precisely because its power to terrify could be turned outward against your enemies rather than inward against yourself. As the centuries passed and Greek art matured into what we now call the classical period, the image of Medusa began to soften, gradually transforming from a grotesque mask into something closer to the beautiful, sorrowful face familiar from Ovid's later telling of her story. By the time Roman artists were carving her likeness onto everything from floor mosaics to fountains, she had become less a symbol of raw terror and more a study in tragic beauty, her serpent hair rendered almost delicately, her expression often caught somewhere between anguish and quiet defiance rather than pure monstrous rage. This transformation continued long after the ancient world itself had faded into history. Renaissance sculptors and painters returned again and again to Perseus and Medusa as subjects, drawn to the dramatic possibilities of the moment of beheading, the reflected shield, the strange birth of Pegasus from the wound. If you have ever seen images of the bronze statue by Benvenuto Cellini standing in Florence, Italy, showing Perseus holding Medusa's severed head aloft, or the many paintings across European museums depicting Andromeda chained to her rock, you have seen this ancient Greek story still being told, just through marble and oil paint instead of a fireside voice. Even now, in our own time, Medusa's image continues to shift and find new meaning. In recent decades, some artists and writers have returned to her story, specifically through the lens Ovid gave us all those centuries ago, emphasizing her as a survivor of violence who was punished rather than protected, using her image to speak to very modern conversations about justice and blame. It is a striking thing, when you think about it slowly here in the dark, that a face first carved onto a temple wall nearly 3,000 years ago is still being reinterpreted, still finding new emotional resonance, long after every person who first heard this story by firelight has been gone for well over 100 generations. Life in the world that made this story. Let's go inside one more scene before we finally let this story rest, because I think it helps to understand the world that actually produced these tales, not the mythical version, but the real, dusty, sun-baked world of Bronze Age and early Iron Age Greece that gave rise to storytellers who first imagined Perseus at all. Archaeology tells us that the actual historical period loosely associated with these myths, roughly between 1600 and 1100 years before our era, was a time of genuinely impressive palace civilizations centered on sites like Mycenaean, Turins, and Pylos. These were not simple villages. Excavations have uncovered massive fortification walls built from stones so large that later Greeks, as we mentioned earlier, assumed only mythical giants could have moved them. Inside these palaces, archaeologists have found evidence of surprisingly sophisticated bureaucracy, workshops producing fine pottery and bronze work, extensive storerooms for oil and grain, and burial sites containing gold masks, inlaid daggers, and jewelry of a quality that still impresses metalworkers today. And yet, for all that sophistication at the top of society, daily life for most ordinary people living under these Bronze Age kings would have looked remarkably modest. A typical rural household might have consisted of 1 or 2 rooms, a hearth used for both cooking and warmth, storage jars called pith, sunk partway into the floor to keep grain and oil cool and protected from vermin, and very little in the way of furniture beyond perhaps a wooden chest, some low stools, and sleeping mats or simple beds. Meals centered on barley, made into a kind of porridge or flatbread, supplemented with olives, cheese from goats and sheep, whatever vegetables the season allowed, and fish for those living near the coast, with meat reserved mostly for feast days and religious sacrifices rather than ordinary dinners. Clothing, too, would have been far simpler than the elaborate draped garments we sometimes picture from later classical statues. Most people wore a basic tunic, often just a rectangle of woven wool or linen pinned at the shoulders and belted at the waist, dyed if the household could afford it, left the natural color of undyed wool if not. Shoes were a luxury for many, with sandals reserved for travel or for those wealthy enough to own them, meaning bare, calloused feet were simply a normal part of everyday life for most people, adults and children alike. I mention all of this because I think it deepens rather than diminishes the story we have spent this evening walking through together. When the first storytellers imagined Perseus receiving a helmet from the god of the underworld or winged sandals from divine nymphs, they were not simply indulging in idle fantasy. They were imagining, in vivid and deliberate contrast, everything their own hard, dusty, barefoot lives lacked: speed without exhaustion, invisibility without fear, protection without struggle. The gods in these stories gave heroes exactly the things an ordinary Bronze Age farmer or fisherman would have most wished for on a long, hot day of physical labor. And that longing, quiet and universal, is perhaps the truest historical detail buried inside this entire myth. Fate, oracles, and the shape of a life there is one more thread worth pulling on gently before we close our eyes tonight, and it has to do with fate itself, since almost every major turn in this story circles back to that single oracle delivered to King Acrisius so long before Perseus was even born. The ancient Greeks took the idea of fate remarkably seriously, and it is worth understanding why, because it shapes almost every myth from this era, not just the story of Perseus. Many Greeks believed that even the gods themselves were bound, at least to some degree, by fate, personified sometimes as three sister goddesses called the Moirai, who spun, measured, and finally cut the thread of every mortal life. Zeus, king of the gods, could act with tremendous power throughout these stories, but even he is occasionally shown deferring to fate rather than overriding it outright, weighing the fates of mortal heroes on a golden scale rather than simply deciding their outcomes by personal whim. Given that worldview, it makes a certain grim sense that Acrisius's entire elaborate scheme, the bronze prison, the chest set adrift at sea, decades of careful avoidance, ultimately accomplished nothing except delaying the inevitable by exactly as long as fate had already allowed. Ancient audiences listening to this story would not necessarily have found that ending unfair or overly cruel. Many would likely have found it almost satisfying in a dark, orderly way, further proof that human effort to outmaneuver a divine prophecy was, at its core, a kind of quiet arrogance, doomed from its very first move. This is worth sitting with for a moment, especially at this hour, because it stands in real contrast to how a lot of modern storytelling handles fate and free will. Many of our own stories today tend to celebrate the idea of defying destiny, rewriting your own ending through sheer willpower and determination. The ancient Greek imagination, at least in stories like this one, was often more interested in something quieter and more melancholy, the dignity, or sometimes the tragedy, of living out a fate you never chose, and doing so with whatever grace or courage you can manage along the way. Perseus, notably, did not seek to kill his grandfather. He did not rage against fate or try to outrun it the way Acrisius had. He simply lived his life as honestly as he could, kept his promises, protected the people he loved, and the prophecy still found its way to completion regardless, through nothing more dramatic than a badly aimed discus on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Perhaps that is part of why this story has lasted as long as it has. It does not offer the tidy comfort of a hero triumphing completely over fate through cleverness alone. It offers something a little more honest and a little more human, a reminder that even the most careful plans, whether made by a frightened old king or by any one of us lying here tonight, rarely account for everything the future actually holds. And yet life goes on anyway, quietly, the way Perseus's did, filled with both triumph and sorrow in roughly equal measure, exactly as it does for most people in most centuries in most corners of the world. Let your breathing slow now, the way it naturally wants to at this hour. There is nothing left to solve tonight, no oracle left to interpret, no monster left to face. Just the quiet, settled feeling of a very old story finally, gently, coming to its end. Written in the stars, there is a reason this particular myth has managed to survive so vividly across nearly 3,000 years, when so many other old stories from the ancient world have faded into obscurity, remembered only by specialists poring over fragments of papyrus. Part of that reason has to do with the night sky itself. If you have ever looked up on a clear, dark autumn evening, far away from city lights, you may have unknowingly looked directly at this story without realizing it. The constellation Perseus sits in the northern sky, positioned near Andromeda, near Cassiopeia, near Cepheus, and even near Cetus, the sea monster, and Pegasus, the winged horse born from Medusa's wound. Ancient astronomers, working long before telescopes, before any real understanding of what stars actually were, looked up at these particular clusters of light and saw, or perhaps simply decided to see, the shapes of this very story frozen permanently into the heavens. Cassiopeia, the vain queen whose boasting set the whole disaster with the sea monster in motion, is often depicted as a distinctive W or M shape, depending on the season and the tilt of the sky, and ancient stargazers imagined her seated on her throne, in some tellings bound upside down for half of every night as a form of eternal, gentle punishment for her pride. Nearby, Cepheus, her husband, forms a fainter, house-shaped pattern of stars. Andromeda stretches out in a long chain of stars representing the very pose she once held chained to that rock, waiting for a monster that never got the chance to reach her. And Perseus himself, sword in hand, is shown in the stars still holding aloft the head of Medusa, represented by a star called Algol, whose name comes from Arabic and means something like the demon's head, since ancient observers notice that this particular star dims and brightens on a regular cycle, a genuinely real astronomical phenomenon we now understand as an eclipsing binary star system. Two stars orbiting each other so that one periodically passes in front of the other from our point of view here on Earth. To ancient sky watchers with no concept of orbital mechanics, a star that pulsed and dimmed on its own schedule, sitting exactly where Medusa's monstrous eye would be in the picture, must have seemed like confirmation that the old story was, in some sense, still alive and watching from above. It is worth pausing here on how differently ancient people related to the night sky compared to most of us today. In a world without artificial lighting, the stars were not a rare treat glimpsed occasionally on a camping trip. They were a constant, nightly presence, bright and detailed in a way that is genuinely difficult for most modern people to picture, unless they have been fortunate enough to stand somewhere truly free of light pollution. Farmers used the rising and setting of certain star groups to time planting and harvest. Sailors navigated entire voyages by tracking familiar constellations across the dark water. And storytellers, generation after generation, had an enormous, detailed canvas overhead every single clear night, perfectly suited for anchoring their myths permanently into the shared experience of anyone who simply looked up. This is part of why the story of Perseus never really needed a written text to survive for its first several centuries of life. Long before Hesiod or any other poet set these tales down on papyrus, an ordinary person could point upward on a clear night, trace out the shape of a hero holding a monstrous head, and retell the whole story from memory, prompted by nothing more than the pattern of light scattered across the dark. The sky itself functioned as an enormous communal storybook, open every single night to anyone willing to look up and remember. How we actually know this story, I think it is worth taking a slower, more careful look now at where this story we have been telling tonight actually comes from, because the honest answer is more complicated, and in its own way more interesting, than simply saying it is an old Greek myth. The earliest surviving mentions of Perseus appear in the work of Hesiod, a poet working sometime around the 7th century before our era, whose theogony gives us some of the oldest written details about the Gorgons and their monstrous parentage. But Hesiod's account is brief, more of a genealogical reference than a full narrative mentioning Medusa, mainly to explain where Pegasus and Chrysaor came from. The fuller, more connected story we have been following tonight, with the wooden chest, the island of Seriphos, the wedding feast, the winged sandals and the cap of Hades, comes to us mainly through much later sources, particularly a Greek writer traditionally called Apollodorus, whose work known as the Bibliotheca, compiled somewhere between the 1st century before our era and the 2nd century after it, gathered together many older myths into something closer to a connected reference work. The Roman poet Ovid, writing his Metamorphoses in the early years of our own era, roughly 700 years after Hesiod, gave us the version of Medusa's backstory involving Athena's temple and Poseidon, the version that reframes her as a victim, rather than simply a monster born that way. Ovid was writing for a Roman audience centuries removed from the world that first imagined these stories, and he was, importantly, a poet interested in transformation and tragedy as literary themes, not a historian trying to preserve an older, more authentic version of the tale. His retelling reflects his own artistic interests as much as it reflects any older oral tradition he might have drawn from. What this means practically is that the story of Perseus we think of today as a single, coherent tale is really a composite, assembled from writers separated by hundreds of years, and in Ovid's case, an entirely different language and culture, Latin rather than Greek, Rome rather than Athens or the older Bronze Age world the story is nominally set in. Ancient audiences themselves would have encountered this story in fragments too, through vase paintings showing a single dramatic scene, through temple sculptures, through brief mentions in plays whose fuller texts have since been lost, through the kind of casual oral retelling we imagined earlier happening around a hearth fire. No single ancient Greek person likely ever encountered the story exactly the way we have told it tonight, all at once, in a single connected sitting. This is not a flaw in the story. If anything, it is one of the more remarkable things about ancient mythology as a whole. These stories were resilient specifically because they were never locked into one single authoritative version. They survived by being flexible, by being retold slightly differently by every generation and every region that told them, by absorbing new emphases and new emotional shadings, like the shift from monster to victim that Ovid gave Medusa, without ever losing the basic shape that made the story recognizable in the first place. In some ways, what we have been doing together tonight, gathering these different threads into one calm, connected telling, is simply the latest link in a chain of retelling that stretches back roughly 3,000 years, and will likely continue long after both of us are gone. The women left at home before we return fully to sleep. I want to spend a little more time with Danae, because in most retellings of this story, she disappears from the narrative almost entirely once Perseus grows old enough to act on his own, and I think that quiet erasure is worth noticing rather than simply repeating. For years, likely well over a decade, Danae lived on Seriphos, raising her son largely without the resources or protections a princess of Argos would ordinarily have expected. Bronze Age and early Iron Age women, even those of noble birth, were bound tightly to the domestic sphere in ways that shaped nearly every hour of their daily lives. Spinning and weaving alone could occupy enormous amounts of time. Producing a single length of woolen cloth by hand, from carding raw wool, to spinning it into thread using a simple drop spindle, to finally weaving that thread on an upright loom, could take many weeks of steady, repetitive labor, and a household depended on this cloth for nearly everything: clothing, blankets, sailcloth, burial shrouds, and cloth used in religious offerings. We can imagine Danae, in the years before Perseus set off after Medusa, spending long stretches of her days exactly this way, seated near a loom set up against a wall to catch the best light, weighted threads hanging in careful rows, the small wooden loom weights clicking softly against one another as she worked the shuttle back and forth. It was quiet, repetitive work, the kind that leaves plenty of room for thought, and it is worth wondering what she might have thought about during those long hours. A woman raised to expect a life inside a palace, instead spending her days in a modest fisherman's household on an island she likely never chose to see in her life before the sea carried her there in a locked wooden chest. Ancient Greek women of every social rank, whether living in humble island villages or grand palace complexes, generally exercised very limited legal or political power on their own, at least according to how these stories and the surviving legal fragments from later periods describe things. Marriages were typically arranged by fathers or male guardians, property generally passed through male lines, and a woman's security depended heavily on the goodwill of the men around her, whether a father, a husband, or in Danae's case, first an angry king and later a protective fisherman who happened to have decent character. This is part of why the small act of kindness from Dictys carries so much weight in the story. In a world where a woman's entire fate could hinge on which man happened to have authority over her circumstances, finding one who chose protection over exploitation was, quietly, one of the luckiest things that could happen to someone in Danae's position. It is also worth noting that when Polydectes later pressured Danae into an unwanted marriage, forcing her to seek refuge at a sacred altar, the story treats this as a genuine crisis worth resolving through Perseus's dramatic return, rather than as a minor domestic inconvenience. Sanctuary at an altar was one of the very few forms of protection available to someone with little other recourse, a kind of last resort built into the religious structure of the ancient world precisely because ordinary legal protections so often failed people, especially women, who lacked powerful male relatives willing to intervene on their behalf. When Perseus finally does intervene, turning Polydectes to stone, the myth is not just delivering a satisfying comeuppance to a villain. It is resolving, in the only way this kind of story knew how, a very real and very old problem that faced women across the ancient world far more often than any Gorgon ever did. Crossing an ancient sea, let's return, one more time, to that long flight Perseus made across the Aegean and beyond, because it gives us a chance to think a little more slowly about the actual geography these old storytellers had in mind, even if their sense of the wider world beyond Greece itself remained fairly hazy. the Aegean Sea that Perseus would have crossed on his way toward the edges of the known world was, by the time these stories were first being told, already one of the most heavily traveled bodies of water in the ancient Mediterranean. Hundreds of islands, from larger ones like Crete and Rhodes down to tiny outcroppings, barely large enough to support a single fishing village, dotted the water, close enough together in many places that sailors could travel for days without ever losing sight of land entirely, hopping from island to island rather than committing to long, open water crossings. This mattered enormously for the spread of trade, culture, and yes, stories, since a sailor putting in at a small harbor for the night to wait out bad weather would trade news, gossip, and tales along with cargo. And a good story about a local hero could travel from island to island, exactly the way goods and rumors did. Perseus, in his winged flight, would have passed over a landscape of small, whitewashed villages clinging to rocky hillsides, terraced fields of barley and grapevines cut into slopes too steep for a plow alone, and fishing boats bobbing in small, sheltered harbors, their hulls painted with the kind of large, watchful eyes many ancient Mediterranean sailors believed helped ward off misfortune at sea. Beyond the familiar islands of the Aegean, though, Greek geography grew considerably vaguer, and the lands associated with the Gorgons, whether placed near Libya in North Africa or simply described as lying somewhere at the edge of the world, reflect just how limited direct Greek knowledge of the wider Mediterranean and African coastline actually was in the earlier centuries when these myths first began circulating. It is worth remembering that the ancient Greeks, for all their later reputation as careful geographers and historians, spent centuries operating with maps that grew increasingly uncertain and speculative the farther they extended from the familiar waters of the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. Regions like the far reaches of North Africa, or the lands the Greeks vaguely called Ethiopia to the south, existed in the ancient imagination as places where ordinary rules seemed to bend, populated by unusual peoples, unusual animals, and, naturally, unusual monsters. This is not so different, in a way, from how medieval European mapmakers many centuries later would sometimes mark unexplored regions with the phrase "here be dragons," or how any culture throughout history has tended to fill in the blank, unknown edges of its known world with whatever fears and fascinations felt most vivid at the time. So when we imagine Perseus flying out past the edge of the familiar Aegean islands, we are really imagining him flying out past the edge of ordinary Greek knowledge itself, into a region that existed in their minds less as a real, mapped place, and more as a kind of symbolic frontier, a place where heroes were tested precisely, because it lay beyond anything a normal person could expect to safely navigate. That perhaps is the real geography of this story, less a matter of actual coastlines and more a map of where courage was believed to matter most, right at the very edge of what anyone actually understood. The wedding on a foreign shore lets go back for a moment to that rocky coast where Perseus found Andromeda chained above the waves, because the story does not end the instant the sea monster falls. There is a quieter scene that follows, one that most retellings rush past, and it deserves a slower look here in these final, drowsy chapters. Once the creature had been defeated, and Andromeda freed from her chains, the ancient sources tell us that King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia, overwhelmed with relief at seeing their daughter alive after expecting to lose her entirely, welcomed Perseus into their household and quickly arranged the wedding he had been promised. Weddings in the ancient world, whether in the palaces of Bronze Age Greece or in the more loosely described kingdom Cepheus ruled somewhere to the south, were significant communal events, not private affairs between just two people. A royal wedding especially would have involved feasting that stretched across multiple days, animal sacrifices offered to the gods in gratitude, and processions winding through the streets or courtyards, torches carried high even in daylight as a mark of celebration, since fire itself held deep ceremonial meaning in almost every ancient culture around the Mediterranean. Imagine the scene for a moment, calm and warm rather than dramatic. Long tables set beneath awnings woven from reeds or light cloth to soften the strong midday sun. The smell of roasting meat, likely goat or sheep, mixing with the sharper scent of the sea that would have been ever present in a coastal kingdom like this one. Musicians playing simple stringed instruments and reed pipes, their melodies carrying across the courtyard while guests reclined or sat on cushions, sharing wine mixed generously with water, since drinking wine undiluted was generally considered excessive, and even a little uncivilized in much of the ancient Mediterranean world. Andromeda herself, only recently rescued from a fate that had seemed certain and terrible, would have been dressed now in fine cloth rather than the plain garments or bare, chained wrists she wore on that rock, her hair likely arranged carefully by attendants, flowers or ribbons woven through it according to local custom, the sudden shift from expected death to celebrated marriage almost dizzying in its speed. One detail that later ancient sources add to this part of the story, though it complicates the neat, happy ending somewhat, involves a man named Phineus, sometimes described as Andromeda's uncle, who had originally been promised her hand in marriage before the sea monster crisis ever began. According to this version, Phineus arrived at the wedding feast with armed supporters, furious that Perseus had claimed a bride he considered rightfully his own, and a violent confrontation broke out in the middle of the celebration. Perseus, the story tells us, once again resorted to the head of Medusa, still carefully sealed away until that moment, revealing it to turn Phineus and his men to stone rather than risk a drawn-out battle that could easily have gone badly against him and his new bride's family. I mention this less dramatic detail mainly because it reminds us how frequently the head of Medusa continues to function throughout the rest of this story, not as a trophy locked away and forgotten after the main quest concludes, but as an ongoing, almost practical tool Perseus carries with him, used again and again, whenever conventional combat would have placed him at too great a disadvantage. There is something worth noticing in that pattern. The hero of this story rarely wins through raw physical superiority alone. Again and again, from the reflected shield used against Medusa herself, to the invisibility granted by the cap of Hades, to this final use of the severed head against Phineus and his men, Perseus succeeds by relying on tools, cleverness, and the help of others rather than unaided strength. It is a quieter, more thoughtful model of heroism than we sometimes associate with ancient myth, one built as much on preparation and resourcefulness as on courage alone. A goddess who chose him. We have mentioned Athena's involvement in this story several times now, guiding the fatal blow, lending her polished shield, later receiving Medusa's head for her own aegis. But I think it is worth slowing down here at the end of our evening together to consider what that kind of divine attention actually meant within the framework of ancient Greek religious thought. Athena was never simply a background figure, offering convenient assistance whenever the plot required it. She held a very particular and well-defined role among the Greek gods, associated with wisdom, strategic warfare as opposed to the more chaotic bloodlust represented by Ares, and skilled craftsmanship of every kind, from weaving to shipbuilding to the working of bronze and iron. She was also closely associated with the protection of certain favored heroes across many different myths, appearing at crucial moments to guide, advise, or directly intervene on behalf of figures like Odysseus, Heracles, and, as we have spent this evening exploring, Perseus. For an ancient Greek audience, the detail that Athena personally guided Perseus's hand during the killing of Medusa would have carried real theological weight, not just narrative convenience. It signaled that Perseus's success was never meant to be understood as purely his own individual achievement. He succeeded because a god chose to favor him, and that favor itself was understood to be meaningful, a sign that his cause aligned with a kind of cosmic order the Greeks believed the gods ultimately upheld. However messy and morally complicated their behavior could sometimes appear elsewhere in these myths. This is part of why ancient Greek religion functioned so differently from religious traditions built around a single, all-powerful deity. Success or failure in any major undertaking, whether a military campaign, a difficult harvest, or a hero's quest, was consistently understood as something shaped by the shifting attention and favor of multiple gods, each with their own particular interests and grudges, rather than the outcome of one singular divine will. It is also worth noting, gently, the layered irony sitting underneath Athena's role in this particular story, especially if you take Ovid's later version of Medusa's backstory seriously. If Medusa was indeed once a devoted priestess in Athena's own temple, violated there by Poseidon, and then punished by the very goddess she served, then Athena's continued involvement in the story, first cursing Medusa, and later helping guide the blade that finally killed her, creates an uncomfortable thread of continuity that ancient audiences may well have noticed and sat with in their own quiet way, even if the myths themselves never paused to comment on it directly. Ancient Greek religion rarely offered its gods as purely just or purely kind figures. They were powerful, they were often helpful to those they favored, and they could also be petty, jealous, and cruel in ways that mirrored human weakness on a much larger, more consequential scale. Athena's relationship with Medusa across the different versions of this myth captures that complexity perhaps better than almost any other single detail in the whole story. Gold beneath the ground as we drift toward the very end of our evening together, I want to bring you back one final time to Mycenae itself, the city Perseus is credited with founding, because there is something worth knowing about what was actually discovered buried beneath that ground many centuries later. And it connects, in its own quiet way, back to everything we have spent tonight imagining. In the 1870s, a wealthy and somewhat unconventional businessman turned amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann, already famous for his earlier excavations at the site believed to be ancient Troy, turned his attention to Mycenaean, convinced that the legendary wealth described in later Greek poetry, particularly Homer's descriptions of Mycenae as rich in gold, might have some basis in physical reality. Working inside the ancient citadel walls, near what is now called Grave Circle A, Schliemann's team uncovered a series of shaft graves containing the remains of Bronze Age individuals buried with an almost overwhelming quantity of gold. Death masks hammered from thin gold sheets covered several of the faces, including one so striking that Schliemann, in a moment of dramatic flourish that later scholars have gently questioned, reportedly declared that he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon himself, the legendary king who led the Greek forces at Troy in Homer's poetry. Modern dating techniques have since shown that these particular graves actually predate the traditional time frame of the Trojan War by several centuries, meaning Schliemann's dramatic claim almost certainly was not literally accurate. But the underlying discovery remained genuinely remarkable regardless. These graves confirmed that Mycenae, whatever its true founding legend, had indeed been an extraordinarily wealthy center of Bronze Age civilization, with access to gold, skilled metalworking, and long-distance trade networks reaching across the eastern Mediterranean, exactly the kind of wealth and power that later Greek storytellers would naturally want to explain through the lens of a heroic founding figure like Perseus. It is worth sitting, for just a moment, with the strange layering of time involved here. A city whose real archaeological remains date back more than 3,000 years. A mythical founding story about Perseus that was likely already considered ancient legend by the time classical Athenian playwrights were staging tragedies about it, sometime around 2,500 years ago. And then, only about 150 years ago, measured against that entire span, an amateur archaeologist digging into the same soil these old stories were set in, pulling gold masks and bronze weapons out of graves that had waited, quiet and undisturbed, for well over 3,000 years. History, when you really slow down and look at it this closely, rarely moves in a single straight line. It folds back on itself, myth and physical evidence sitting close together in the same patch of dry, olive-covered ground, each one telling a slightly different version of the same very old story about a place, and the people who once believed a hero descended from a god had raised its very first walls. Letting the story rest, we have wandered a long way tonight, buddy, from a locked bronze chamber in ancient Argos, out across the wine-dark Aegean, to the edge of a world the Greeks themselves could barely imagine, and finally home again, through weddings and homecomings, and an accident that fulfilled a prophecy nobody wanted to see completed. If you are still listening at all at this point, your mind is likely somewhere soft and unfocused now, drifting the way Danae and infant Perseus once drifted across that quiet, dark water so long ago. I want you to picture one last, gentle image before we close our eyes completely. Not a monster, not a battle, just an ordinary evening on that small island of Seriphos, many years after everything we have talked about tonight had already happened and settled into memory. Perhaps an old fisherman, gray-haired now, mending a net by lamplight, glancing up now and then at the stars beginning to appear overhead, picking out without really thinking about it the familiar shapes of Perseus and Andromeda rising slowly in the east, exactly where they rise every single autumn, exactly where they will rise again tonight, over wherever you happen to be listening from right now, whether that is quiet countryside or a city with too much light to actually see them clearly. The story does not need you to remember every detail. It does not need you to recall the names of the nymphs, or the exact order the gifts were given in, or which ancient poet wrote which particular version centuries ago. All it needs, really, is to be told slowly enough, and gently enough, that it can carry you the rest of the way into sleep, the way old stories have carried tired listeners for longer than anyone can accurately measure. So let your breathing settle. Let your thoughts go soft and unfocused, the edges of this story blurring pleasantly the way distant hills blur in late evening light. There is nothing more to do tonight except rest. The metal that made the myth there is one more quiet detail worth resting on tonight, something easy to overlook in a story so full of gods and monsters, and that is the bronze itself, the actual metal that gave an entire age of history its name, and that shows up again and again throughout this story. From Danae's prison walls to the curved sword Hermes lent Perseus for the killing blow. Bronze is, at its simplest, an alloy made mostly of copper mixed with a smaller amount of tin, and producing it reliably required something that Bronze Age Greece did not actually have much of locally, since usable tin deposits were relatively scarce around the Aegean. This meant that bronze production depended on long-distance trade networks stretching remarkably far for the time, with tin sometimes traveling from sources as distant as modern-day Afghanistan or Western Europe, passed hand-to-hand along trade routes that connected the Aegean world to a much wider and more interconnected ancient economy than people often assume when they picture the Bronze Age as a simple, isolated era. Working this metal into useful objects, weapons, armor, tools, and the kind of architectural fittings imagined lining Danae's prison chamber required real specialized skill. Bronze smiths would have worked near open-air forges, the air thick with smoke and the sharp smell of hot metal, hammering and casting under considerable heat even in the cooler months, since a forge fire needed to stay hot and steady no matter the season outside. A finished bronze sword or shield represented not just raw material value, but weeks or months of skilled labor, making these objects genuinely precious possessions, often passed down through families, or given as significant gifts between allies and kings. Exactly the kind of prestige object a king like Polydex would expect as a wedding gift, and exactly the kind of thing young Perseus, raised in a modest fishing household, simply did not have any way to provide. When the myth describes Hermes lending Perseus a special curved sword capable of cutting through Medusa's unusually tough neck, ancient listeners would have understood this as more than a simple weapon upgrade. A blade capable of such a feat implied metalworking beyond anything available to ordinary mortal smiths, a divine level of craftsmanship, matching the divine nature of the task itself. In a world where a good bronze sword already represented the height of available technology, a blade gifted directly by a god carried an almost sacred weight, a tool that placed Perseus, however briefly, on a level closer to the gods themselves, rather than the ordinary mortal craftsmen and warriors he had grown up around. The rules of a good guest. Let's return once more to Dictys, the fisherman who first pulled Danae and her infant son from the sea. Because his quiet kindness deserves one more moment of attention before we let this whole story finally rest, and because it opens a window onto one of the most important unwritten rules governing the entire ancient Greek world. The Greeks called this concept xenia, often translated loosely as hospitality, though that word in English feels a little too soft and optional for what xenia actually demanded. Xenia was understood as a sacred obligation, protected directly by Zeus in his particular role as Zeus Xenios, guardian of guests and strangers. A host was expected to offer food, shelter, and protection to any traveler who arrived at their door, without demanding to know their identity or purpose first, and a guest, in turn, was expected to behave respectfully, to not overstay their welcome, and to eventually repay that kindness if the opportunity ever arose. Breaking these rules in either direction was considered a serious offense against the gods themselves, not simply bad manners between individuals. This obligation ran so deep through Greek storytelling that entire epic poems turn on its violation. The whole Trojan War, in the traditional mythic account, is set in motion partly because a guest, the Trojan prince Paris, betrayed his host Menelaus by taking Menelaus's wife Helen back to Troy with him, an act understood not merely as personal betrayal, but as a direct violation of xenia serious enough to justify a decade-long war in the moral logic of these old stories. And throughout the Odyssey, Odysseus's long journey home is repeatedly measured against this same standard, with some households, like that of the swineherd Eumaeus, honoring the sacred duty of hospitality even toward a disguised beggar, while others, most notably the suitors overrunning Odysseus's own home in his absence, violate it flagrantly and pay dearly for that violation by the poem's end. Seen against this backdrop, Dictys' actions when he found that waterlogged chest on the shore of Seriphos take on a deeper significance than simple personal kindness. He was fulfilling one of the most sacred obligations recognized anywhere in the ancient Greek world, taking in two total strangers, offering them shelter and protection without any guarantee of reward, and continuing that protection for years afterward at what may well have been some personal risk, given his own brother's growing hostility toward Danae. When Perseus later placed Dictys on the throne of Seriphos in gratitude, the myth was not simply rewarding a nice guy for being nice. It was completing a moral transaction that the ancient audience would have recognized immediately, a debt of hospitality finally and properly repaid, exactly the way these old stories insisted such debts always eventually needed to be. Why we still need monsters as we settle in now toward the very last stretch of our evening together, I want to leave you with one final, quiet thought about why stories like this one, full of monsters and prophecies and impossible quests, have managed to survive across so many thousands of years, told and retold by cultures that otherwise had almost nothing else in common with each other. Monster stories, across nearly every culture historians and folklorists have ever studied, tend to serve a purpose that goes beyond simple entertainment. They give shape and a face to fears that would otherwise remain vague and unmanageable: the fear of death, the fear of chaos breaking into an ordered life, the fear of forces entirely beyond human control. Medusa, whose gaze alone could turn a living person into cold, permanent stone, gave the ancient Greek imagination a concrete, nameable shape for something close to the fear of sudden, senseless death itself, an ending that could arrive in an instant, without warning, simply by being in the wrong place and glancing in the wrong direction. And Perseus, in turn, gave that same ancient audience something equally important: a model for how an ordinary person, not born a demigod of unusual strength like Heracles, but simply a fisherman's adopted son with no particular advantages, might still find a way through impossible danger. Not through raw power alone, as we discussed earlier tonight, but through patience, borrowed wisdom, careful preparation, and the willingness to accept help rather than face everything entirely alone. That combination, ordinary origins paired with careful, humble cleverness rather than brute invincibility, may be part of why this particular hero remained so consistently popular across so many centuries of Greek and later Roman storytelling. Long after flashier, more powerful mythical figures had faded into relative obscurity. There is a reason, I think, that stories like this one still find their way into quiet bedrooms almost 3,000 years later, told now through a screen rather than a fire, heard through headphones rather than gathered in a single room around a hearth. The specific fears change with every generation, but the basic shape of what these stories offer, comfort in the face of the unknown, the reassurance that even ordinary people facing impossible things might still find a way through if they are patient and willing to accept help, remains remarkably steady. That, more than any single detail about winged sandals or bronze shields, might be the truest reason this story has lasted long enough to reach you tonight, wherever and whenever you happen to be listening. Rest now. There is nothing left to fear in this story, and nothing left to remember. Just let it go, soft and slow, the way the tide finally lets go of anything it has carried long enough. And that, buddy, is the story of Perseus, a boy set adrift in a wooden chest, raised by a kind fisherman on a small, forgotten island, sent on an impossible errand out of wounded pride, who came home carrying the head of a monster and a wife rescued from a chain, only to find that the very fate his grandfather spent a lifetime trying to escape had been waiting patiently the whole time, quiet and unremarkable, hidden inside something as ordinary as a discus thrown at an athletic game. If your eyes are already closed, that is exactly where they should be. There is nothing more to remember, nothing to write down, nothing waiting for you tomorrow that this story owes you. Just let it drift, the way that old wooden chest once drifted across a dark and quiet sea, carrying something precious safely toward whatever shore is waiting for you. If you enjoyed spending this time with me, I would be grateful if you subscribed and left the channel a little note about which old story you would like to hear next, told slowly, the same way, by the same fire. There are so many more of these quiet corners of history waiting to be walked through together. Until then, sleep well wherever you are, whatever time it happens to be where you are listening from tonight. I will be right here again next time. Good night.